welcome to this first session for the year for Duke Reads. My name is Frank Stasio. I'm the host of a radio show called The State of Things here at North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC. We're in brand new studios, and I hope you can tell the difference. State-of-the-art technology, and I think it's going to make things go a lot more smoothly and hopefully get people more engaged as well. Tonight, Duke's Provost Peter Lange is joining us. He is the Chief Academic Officer of Duke. He's been at Duke since 1981. Before that, he taught at Harvard, earned a BA from Oberlin, his PhD from MIT in 1975, and while at Duke, he served as Special Assistant to the Provost for International Affairs from 1993 to 1994, and then as a Vice Provost for Academic and International Affairs from 94 to 96. Also chaired the committee that produced Curriculum 2000, and since 1999 has served as Provost. Pleasure to have you here. Great to see you.
Great to be here.
And of course, we're going to talk about this book, which by now you've had plenty of time to take a look at, William Cohan's House of Cards, A Tale of Hubris and Wretched Excess on Wall Street. So as always, we're happy to take your questions via email. We've got a couple already to start with, and let's start with the very first question that you've asked. To what extent did the long-term corporate culture that developed over decades at Bear Stearns affect the likelihood of that collapse?
Well, you know, this question really came to me because I'm a social scientist, okay? And so we're always looking for general causes rather than specific causes, right? And you're reading an institutional history here, which is a beautifully done institutional history, kind of surprises you halfway through the book because you've read the sort of close-up events and then all of a sudden he jumps to this wonderful long history of the company. So you can get sucked into thinking this is all about Bear Stearns and its unique culture. Yet we know that similar things were happening and that similar collapses happened in multiple companies. So you've got to ask yourself the question, is this a Bear Stearns problem? Should we be looking at the corporate culture of Bear Stearns? Or should we understand the corporate culture of Bear Stearns as just being one form of a corporate culture that was being generated in an entire industry? And, you know, I have to think that a lot of it was a much more general phenomenon than you just saw at Bear Stearns, even though he recounts wonderful, strange internal practices and, you know, there's the different ethnic compositions of different firms on Wall Street and all of that. But yet, in the end, you really wonder how much was it specific and how much was it general?
Well, and the question too, and again, I think Cohan does a great job, as you say, of getting us up close, and we really see the individuals involved. We see how their personalities came to form the corporate culture here in a particular company. Pans back, and we get to see Dolly's back and get to see a little bit bigger picture. But you have to ask yourself, to what extent do any people like this thrive outside of an economic structure, or a financial, I shouldn't say economic, but a financial structure that promotes that kind of behavior and that kind of activity?
Well, it promotes it and it permits it, both. And I would say both are true. That is, it promotes it because, you know, these are all very, very smart people. I mean, one of the things you're struck by in this book, these are no dummies, right? These are people that are being selected for their intelligence and for their creativity. And then they're being thrown in to a business in which the opportunities to exercise that creativity, and I think they were tremendously creative in some ways, to exercise that creativity around the creation of profit and new financial instruments is tremendously rewarded. And there isn't much else that's rewarded, right? And so it is a culture which feeds on both their intelligence and their creativity, gives them this tremendous space, and then rewards them in this phenomenal way. I mean, you read about the amount that people were making in bonuses, and we'll come to bonuses later maybe, but in bonuses is just very striking. And then the lifestyles that promotes, and it really, I think, you have to say, it just cuts people off from the other moorings, which they would have if they were in a different setting.
It cuts them off, or they may have been sort of that the nature of this business has selected for that kind of personality. And
I'm not sure I would believe. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I would believe that. Although I think that was probably more true in the 40s and 50s and 60s. You know, in the 80s and 90s, we had at Duke and at schools like we we have tens and hundreds of students moving off to here. So I don't believe they all have these very unique personality characteristics that would mean that they were already pre-selected for that. I think, when we give broad education, we actually try to develop those moorings, and I don't think our students leave not having them. I think they just get severed from them by the temptations, if you will. This is incredibly Manichaean language, but by the temptations, and the opportunities and the incentives that this industry provided to them.
But that's the point exactly, because the foundation of the economic system, we'll leave the financial structure aside, but the principle is this. Look, greed is good because if everybody's looking out for themselves, all of us are going to benefit. Doesn't this prove that that's a little bit not true? That there's a way you can structure things so I'm looking out for me and the rest of us could be left behind in a very bad way?
I absolutely believe that's true, but whose responsibility is it to curb the greed, right? In other words, this is an industry that breeds on greed, okay? Now, whether it has to be greed that's rewarded in precisely this structure, there are lots of structures you can put in place to limit the effects of greed. I mean, we all know that the weakness of regulation, the structure of the bonus. I'll tell you that anybody who was a microeconomist and would go in, or a microsociologist, and would go in and look at these companies, could I have identified many areas where the incentives were completely perverse, and they would have told you the incentives were completely perverse. But the company promoted them, the industry promoted them, and as a result, the people behaved consistent with those incentives. It's not that we should try, or that we could prevent people from being greedy, right? But we can regulate the effects of the greed in such a way that it's collectively good and not just individually good and for the short run, and then collectively bad for the long run.
Right, so the rules of the game, and I know we're going to get to that. Along these lines, I want to get to Melanie Burkett's question or comment. She says, I found the commentary on page 267 on the language used at Bear Stearns. This is a very interesting point here. The language of which the book overflows with examples. You really do need to read quietly if children are around.
It's true.
Very interesting. And noticed a distinct difference in language in the quotes from Lehman Brothers executives in the epilogue. The profanity and bravado of Bear employees seem to be used to build the hubris and wretched excess argument. But then again, the nicer guys at Lehman ended up, worse off. So what is the answer to question one?
Well, as I've tried to suggest, and I think that, Melanie, was that her name?
Yes.
Yeah, I think Melanie's actually made my point very well. Here we have two companies which seem to have different corporate cultures, but underlyingly the effects were the same. So the language was different, the way the presentation of self of the employees was different, but in the end, the underlying behaviors were not that different. And I believe that's because of the broader structure that pervaded the companies that were in this industry, rather than the particular culture of a particular company. And actually, language is a wonderful entry point to that, as she points out.
Why don't we move on to the second point, because I think we're going to end up coming back to a lot of these. The author refers to hubris and wretched excess in the title. There is no question that these qualities were present in profusion, but how do they actually affect the outcome? Let's start there.
So I think that they affected the outcome because of what we already discussed in part, right? That over time as they develop, they overwhelm the other human qualities that these individuals had. In fact, they become permissive of qualities of a number of the people in the book, which you're really astonished as a normal daily life person, right? That people would do some of the things that they do. Whether they are in their businesses or in their personal lives. And I think that you are struck over time with the fact that they became so convinced of their own merit at some level, and that their merit was somehow measured by the amount of money they were making, and then, of course, that produced benefits which in turn reinforced that sense of just being an enormously meritorious person. And that unhinges them, really, from all those other qualities, which I'm sure they brought to the job originally, or at least some of them did. I can't believe all these. And, there are people described in the book who you see are more struck by the ambiguities of the business, but of course they're in the business and they sort of go along with it. And there's one person, you'll notice when you read his book that there are certain people that talked a lot more to him than other people. and they present themselves partly as involved and partly as external observers, right? And when they're external observers, they're sort of observing the fact that their colleagues were not really behaving, but you really wonder, well, what were they doing day to day, you know?
right.
Were they out there saying, hey, what are we doing here? I don't think so.
And how much of that, I know there's some great research on this very topic right here on this campus, the kind of being cut off from the consequences. I mean, you don't know the people who are losing their homes or who are bound to lose their homes. You know the bubble's going to burst. Your company's borrowing $75 million a morning and then paying it all back. So your sense of the world is so far different. When you talk about being cut off, part of it is your success, but part of it is not having any contact with the people down the line who actually are involved in these transactions.
I think that's true, but there are lots of businesses that's true, right? So what makes this one different? What makes this one what allowed this one to become so detached from those consequences? Because there are lots of business where people don't really have contact with it. I can even say that at an institution like Duke. I know there are things I could do in the Provost's office that would be damaging to people somewhere else in the institution that I don't have very much contact with, or maybe no contact with. But the institution doesn't really permit me, by the structure of the interactions with the people I have to work with, to ever do that. And it doesn't permit me to lose my broader sense of my moral stance toward the world, if you want to get sort of haughty about it.
That's an excellent example, because I think Duke is a great example of a neighbor that has over time, particularly over this past decade, become much more conscious of its place in the neighborhood.
Right.
And not just from the point of view of image and public relations, but truly improved its standing as a neighbor in this community.
Right. And its engagement with the community, yeah.
That's because it had a stake. I mean, how much does that have to do with the fact that you really do have a stake in this? And these guys don't. If you lose your house, some guy in Kansas City, I still get my $75 million, and he gets mad. I'm on a tangent here, because his $75 million bonus, because of his investment scheme, they changed the rules, remember that?
Right.
Gets cut to $45 million,
Right.
and he's going to go home and cry.
Right, I know. Right. Yeah, but let me ask you something. So let's just take that question, okay?
Yeah.
So we can take people way, way closer to that person making the loan, and they weren't engaged with the consequences either, because there were people out there selling those loans to the individual homeowner that who either knew or should have known that the loan they were selling was incredibly dependent on conditions in the market that couldn't be sustained over time. So you don't need to go all the way up to the top of Bear Stearns to find that disconnection between behavior and consequences for others. So we have to, if we want to ask that question, we got to ask ourselves, how does that happen? And I don't have a full answer to that. But clearly, when you read about the mortgage industry, not these people now, but the mortgage, you read about the pressure from above, right, to sell those mortgages and building a structure of rewards for the people selling those mortgages, which basically drove them away. Now, I do believe that some people would go into that business and some people wouldn't. I do believe. But I think once people get in that business, maybe they're a little more inclined. But I don't think they were really out there from day one to say, I'm just going to work over a bunch of poor subprime borrowers and sell them mortgages that are going to be horrible for them. From day one, I don't think people did that.
No, nobody sort of wakes up every day figuring how they're gonna ruin their neighbor. But again, as you said, the way we structured the incentives. I mean, clearly, those loans were structured in a way that told you the institutions knew they were going to collapse, because all the money was up front. You had to pay huge fees.
Exactly.
So we get ours, and then. But the second thing that happened was, it's a bad business plan to sell credit to people who aren't credit worthy.
Right.
So pretty soon you're going to realize that was a bad idea, unless somebody takes that bad paper and does what these guys did, which is atomize it. Right.
Chop it up, put it into new packages, resell it. It gets more and more abstracted every time. People are less, from the economists will say you know, what was going on here was the information in this industry got horrible. People didn't even understand what they were doing. They didn't know what they were selling, right? I mean, that's pretty clear, even in the book.
Yeah.
Even the people who were very smart and who were at the peak of this industry didn't know what they were selling and didn't really have a huge incentive to totally figure it out, right?
But somebody did. The regulators did, and they
Right,
had
and
to know that this.
And they failed.
And did they fail? Were they not watching? Did the whistleblowers get fired? I mean, what was really?
Well, you're asking me questions outside the book, but I read the newspaper.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think it's pretty clear that we have gone through a long phase of believing that markets would self-regulate and that governments tended to reduce returns without providing any reduction of risk. So that basically, you know, regulation, you know, some people would argue regulation is all for the good. Some people would argue, well, regulation changes the return, but it reduces the risk. Okay, you could take it either way you want, but the point is that we got out of the regulation business, and you just need to read last week the story about the SEC and the Madoff thing to understand that basically nobody in one of our preeminent regulatory agencies was really interested in regulating the industry which they were supposed to regulate.
Because they believed that regulation was a bad thing,
Exactly.
the government was the problem, and what the book points out, I think, quite clearly is it depends on where you put the incentives. If the incentive really is to put people in housing and help keep them there, then you're encouraging an industry, you're encouraging construction, you're encouraging neighborhood building, people paying taxes. But all that would be great if you really, you know, got people into that business. If all you're doing is making money off the loan, turns out that's not right. So somebody's got to write a rule that makes sure the incentives are in the right place.
But remember, we did half of it, right? So several administrations, he points out very clearly, several administrations actually were pushing people to own homes. In fact, we got over-enthusiastic about that. And then we did that part, and we never did the regulatory part, and we pushed a lot of people to buy homes who were probably pretty marginal to buy homes, even if the industry had been appropriately regulated, much less in this deregulated and somewhat corrupted mortgage market, right? So there was a public policy piece here, which was saying home ownership is good no matter what, and let's get more and more people into home ownership, and let's help them get into that without ever thinking about, well, how are we going to actually regulate this industry so that we don't create the kinds of excesses that we then saw.
I want to remind you now we're talking about House of Cards with Provost Peter Lange, and we are inviting your questions. So please send us a question via live@duke.edu, and we're happy to get your questions or your comments on the book aired as we go along. We do have Paul Friedman wants to weigh in on question number 2. He says, you begin the second question about hubris and wretched excess by presupposing the answer. That is, these attributes were in fact present. Hubris certainly was present, but most notably in a way that senior management failed to act. But wretched excess, I don't see evidence of this. And to frame the question this way is, as lawyers say, to assume facts not in evidence.
Well, that's an interesting observation. Would we have considered fiddling while Rome burned to be wretched excess? If we consider fiddling while Rome burned, and Nero certainly is a person we've historically considered an example of excess, if not wretched excess. How about playing bridge while your company's going down the tubes? I don't mean to dismiss Paul's question, because I think it's a reasonable question, but I think there are lots of examples in here of wretched excess. I think there are also. But it's his title anyway. I mean, you know, I'm not wedded to the title, and I'm not wedded to the words wretched excess. But I think there are many examples in here. I mean, how about 4-day work weeks for people that are pulling down millions and millions of dollars a year? I don't know if that's wretched excess or something else. But you read it all through the book. People were taking off on Thursdays. They were annoyed if they had to show up to work on Fridays. They're flying off. You know, I mean, one person's wretched excess is another person's phenomenal success. But
well, and that's, I think, where this debate and the debate that we're having now about how to regulate this industry, where to go from here, I think gets a little confused, because if the question is, should we limit how much money people can have, and whether or not $75 million a year, or, in your investment is too much, we do run afoul of, pardon me, the sort of American ethos of being able to earn whatever you can. But if you look at the first part of this, we talked earlier about where to put the incentives. If you're going to make a lot of money building houses that people are going to live in, and counsel people on how to pay back their loan so that they stay in that neighborhood, and you make a lot of money doing that, we're happy to do that. You get rich, take all the vacations you want, and buy the best golf clubs in the world. All good. So I think if we could frame the question that way, we'd come up with a much different answer, a kind of private economy where you could make as much as you want, but the incentives are really to produce things that we can all use.
Well, let me take the example of housing which you just raised, okay? So I had a house that it wasn't built, it was renovated practically from the ground up, unfortunately, but anyway. It wasn't what we planned, but it happened anyway.
Never
it
is.
happened anyway. It never is. But in any case, my contractor had a 3-year agreement that if things that he did on that house weren't going to work, he was going to fix them, right? Now, one of the problems with these bonus plans was people were walking away with the money sometimes on day one, or they were walking away with a lot of it, right? And of course, so it's the size, but it's also the structure of the payment system. And, one of the interesting things is in the current climate, we've had, the word bonus has become completely a dirty word. But if we really understand what has gone on in the finance industry, we've kind of conflated the bonuses of the senior executives who are making hundreds of millions or tens of millions of dollars on top of a tens of millions of dollars salary, with the person 4 or 5 down level who gets $75,000 a year and makes another $75,000 when he's started. His bonus is half of his salary. So we've sort of conflated all the bonus. Now, whether that structure of payment is a good, my own view is the higher up you get in the business, the smaller you should need a bonus to be. Because the higher you get up in the business, the more you ought to be self-motivated to do the work you do. Okay? And in fact, that's what you want the person. So they should be getting paid a salary at the top, maybe a very big salary, but a small bonus. And people further down who might need actually that incentive to do their best work could have more of their salary at risk through a bonus. It's sort of an odd inversion that we've got, that the people who have to be most deeply motivated to actually make that industry work are getting the most money in a bonus. I think that's sort of odd. I would rather pay them in a salary and pay them a little bonus.
Yeah, you would think.
For that added little marginal effort. Because I know if I look around myself, that people who have to come every day and do the drudge work, they don't always want to perform at the top end. But the people at the top of the business, they're tremendously motivated to succeed with that business.
Unless the reason you got there, unless the business itself, again, getting back to the structure, selects for people who are only motivated by profit. And then you have to keep feeding them, and the feed has to get bigger and bigger.
But you don't have to feed them with these mega bonuses. You could still have a different structure.
Let's move on to the next discussion point. Fascinating discussion about what happened in the immediate aftermath of the collapse. Oh, I love this moment in the book. As the remaining leadership at former Bear Stearns figured out that they still had bargaining leverage that could improve the initial outcome of the deal with J.P. Morgan. Classic bargaining situation ensued after it seemed that Bear Stearns had no bargaining leverage. What does this tell us about the rationality of this? You outline it for us, because every time I try to reconstruct it, it's so baffling to me. But then I get it.
Okay, so let me see if I can do. I had to write down notes for this, so you'll have to excuse me if I go to my notes. But okay, so they basically J.P. Morgan buys Bear Stearns for $2 a share, which everybody knows is a ridiculously low price. Okay, and they face a problem, which is that lots of people, J.P. Morgan faces a problem that lots of people may think that the deal won't stick. And if the deal doesn't stick, that everything will collapse. And so they'll have bought a because then they'll have bought a company that actually goes bankrupt anyway. So they have none of the normal clauses. There's this thing called a material adverse change clause, which is usually in things so that if there's a material adverse change in the deal, the company that's buying can get out of it. So they hadn't included that because they were fearful that people would think, well, that's what J.P. Morgan's going to do. They're going to bail, and the thing won't work. Okay. Similarly, they guaranteed all the trading obligations up front because, again, otherwise people wouldn't trade with things. So they got into a situation where they took on a lot of obligation, right? So nobody really fully considered what happens if the deal fails, right?
That is, if Bear Stearns stockholders don't
approve
it.
the deal,
Okay,
because you'll remember that strange thing where they have a conversation back and forth at a meeting of J.P. Morgan leaders with some financial reporters, and they say, well, what exactly is this guarantee of all of the you're guaranteeing all of the deals that Bear Stearns is going to make. Are you really guaranteeing them forever? And he says, yeah, up to a year. And then they say, well, what if the shareholders disapprove the deal? Are you guaranteed? Well, they have up to a year to approve the deal. So they're suggesting there could be a vote, and then there could be a revote, and then there could be a revote. Well, at some point, the Bear Stearns leadership wakes up, and the Bear Stearns big stockholders and wake up and say, wait a moment, these guys actually, we have them over a barrel, right? We have them over a barrel. So they basically get to a situation where, there's a quote, I think this is a quote, there's a serious wrinkle about how the guarantees have been structured, okay? Now you have to ask yourself, okay, at the end of and what was going to happen was the whole deal could go for a whole year. J.P. Morgan could be stuck with all the consequences of all the deals struck through that year. And at the end of the year, the shareholders could not have approved, and J.P. Morgan would be left holding the bag. Bad deal, right? Bad deal. Now you have to ask yourself, how did that happen? Okay, so, I've shortened the story. There's a lot, but folks can go read it, or if they haven't read it already. But that's basically the essence of it. So you got to ask yourself, all right, here's all these very smart people, right? Here's all these lawyers, okay, but working under phenomenal short-term pressure, right? So one interpretation is they just screwed up, right? And so it's a sort of limit to the rational structure of the thing when people are under that much pressure and have to work under that short a period of time, which is a lesson for all of us, right? But then you'll notice in the book, Alan Schwartz says at one point, well, before we jump to that conclusion, ask yourself whether the alternative, which was not to guarantee those things, not to get yourself in that situation, would have been better. And it's an interesting question. I don't actually have the answer to that question, but it's interesting that Schwartz, who was the one who led the company to take advantage of the situation they did in, because in the end they get $10 a share, whether he's actually right that what we think is a limit on rationality was actually people waking up and saying, well, we got two bad choices, which one are we going to take? So then the limit on rationality goes further, which is why J.P. Morgan did it in the first place.
And because there was a point at which it was a reasonable deal, and it was somewhere around $10 about too, and the folks at Morgan thought, well, $2 is better than nothing, they're going to take it. Oops.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So there was a point at which it was, and I think it was trading for around $52 a share before the collapse.
Even more.
When at its peak, it was 100 and something. But
yeah, right. I think something like that.
But as the tumble, it tumbled.
Yeah,
I mean,
it collapsed in 3 days. So.
Yeah. And the quickness with which, they thought they had 30 days to put the deal together, and all of a sudden it was, Geithner was in on that. It was like, we're going to do it.
It was the weekend. We're doing it this weekend.
We're doing it this weekend. And again, you have to ask yourself the question whether or not these regulators, even a guy like Geithner, who at the time was the head of the Fed Bank in New York, what? Did nobody have a contingency for this? Some of these elements, as you said, we had to know the housing market was going to collapse, and we had to understand maybe
the housing market had been collapsing for a while already before Bear Stearns went under. So you can't say that.
That's
It was
true.
not. It wasn't a surprise any longer.
Right.
It might have been a surprise 6 or 8 months earlier, but it wasn't. But how fast it was going to go, and people are still saying today they don't. One thing that is holding back the recovery is the failure of banks to extend as much credit as they could, given how much cash they're sitting on. And so people are still asking themselves, are the banks holding on to all that cash because they actually don't know how deep they're still in and what still could go wrong? Well, certainly in the commercial real estate market. So there's still a tremendous amount of ignorance or anxiety about things not known out there even today. And we've been into this now for almost 2 years in terms of the collapse of the housing market.
Right.
And a year since Lehman Brothers. So.
And I think to look at regulation too in terms of what, we knew after the 1930s we were going to put some limits on what and definitions on what a bank was. We were going to guarantee deposits so there'd be no run on the bank. All of that was good. Right. And then through the 80s and 90s, institutions that weren't banks and weren't under those regulations suddenly acted like banks.
Absolutely.
And nobody knew what the impact of that would be. We do now.
Well, you go back to the 30s, of course, we said that's a bad idea, right? I mean, Glass-Steagall, that's what they said was not a good idea, but that was part of that deregulating environment, right? So what do we have that? Why don't we separate those two things? It gives them more cash. They can turn more cash around. They can generate more income. They can push more money out into the market. They can lend more money. That heats up the economy. That's all good. Who cares? So there's just that loss of a sense of the need to regulate these market forces, and in fact, a tremendous impulse across a whole range of things to find a way to give the market the freest possible reign of action, the freest possible range of action to go forward, I think.
Yeah, well, you would like money to find the smartest place for it to go, as long as, but your hope is that it's going to produce things that are useful and necessary to all of us, or even great luxury goods, but that are somehow good for us. But if it ends up in the pockets of very few people, and again, incentives to, if the incentive is for shareholder value, I can do that a couple of ways at my corporation. One way is to strip the company of labor, is to strip the product of quality.
Right.
I can increase the value. I get my bonus, right? Because now the company's worth a lot more. We're putting less steel in your car. We've got fewer people to do it. Quality has gone down. Value of the company's gone up, and I get my bonus. That doesn't help me.
As long as you don't have a longer-term perspective on that company. Right. And that's part of the issue. We know that in the U.S., more than in most of our comparable political economies around the world, the sort of short-run bottom line mentality rules even more.
And you heard from businessmen, and even in this book, we would love for the rules to change so that everybody was playing by rules that, in a sense, forced us to take the long view, because we do know what we're doing to our company. Is there a way to do that? And do you think, we're a little bit off the top of the book, we're going to move on in a second, but I'm curious to know how you feel if, in this moment, if there is a kind of impetus to get some sort of regulation that would do just that.
I think there's quite a bit of impetus, but it's fundamentally a political problem. Right. And it eventually will get down to pretty nitty-gritty politics at the level of the Senate and the House. And we know in the Senate that we have a balance of power. It's ironic, but we still have a balance of power such that there are very few critical voters on most, senators on most issues. And what's going to matter is where their values lie on these questions and how firmly and strongly they adhere to those values. And so, sure, there are regulatory frameworks we could set up that would better this, but whether we're going to get them, that remains to be seen. Right?
Let's move on. Point number 4. Did we cover everything in 3? I think we did. That was essentially it. Yeah. An incident described in the book regarding Bear Stearns, which seems to reflect a remarkable level of deceit and dishonesty, very weak oversight, seemingly very profitable business. How does one explain the emergence of this situation? Greed, one possibility, hubris, another, combination maybe. Are there lessons for how we can sustain the ethical culture and a highly dynamic and profitable situation, a highly profitable business.
Now you know these are the two guys that are they're in court now. This is Chaffee and Tannen, right? And they were running these hedge funds within within a spin-off of Bear Stearns that was connected to Bear Stearns. Okay, so what struck me about this incident in the book is that it's the only place where you see open and intentional deceit of other people, right? They don't talk straight to their superiors, and they don't talk straight to the financial reporters when they have to report, and they don't give accurate information. You know, they say they're doing one thing when they're doing another thing. I mean, it is the only place in the book where you wonder whether it's really down to individuals rather than that broader, just to go back to our earlier, rather than the broader structures in which the people were working. And I was very, very struck and very fascinated. Now, these guys are potentially going to jail, right? Because of fraud, basically that they fraudulently misled investors in their company. So it's a different. The thing that struck me is it's different from the rest of the book, because it's not like Jimmy Cain letting people run, or some of the other people just letting people do what they want, or having a particular set of values and therefore pursuing it that way. These are people who are actually out there. Now the question though is, why wasn't anybody watching them? Right? And there's an incident in the book where they report up to their superior, and he says, you know, I don't give a damn. Just go away. I got other things to do. It's not central to his day-to-day place where to what he wants to do day to day. And I think there's another point at which no one in the where Bear Stearns is told they can't lend them money anymore, right? So then Bear says, well, if we can't lend them money, then let them go do what they want to do. We're not involved anymore. So it's a kind of little anomalous in the book, but at some level it also comes back again to the overall structure in which all of these events take place.
Right. You just don't ask a lot of questions, and to the extent that we haven't gotten caught yet, I guess it means we never will, which gets back to hubris. Reminding you again, we'd be happy to take your comments or questions on live@duke.edu. Taking questions today about House of Cards, a book by William Cohan on the fall of Bear Stearns, the proximate subject of the book, but of course the broader question of what happened on Wall Street in the meltdown. But on that point, that it is unique and it does stand out, isn't it fascinating that the only seemingly illegal episode in all of this is the anomaly, that essentially nobody broke the rules, and that's how we got into this. Are you worried a little bit? I do when people focus on Bernie Madoff, for instance, and there's so much attention on him. He is the anomaly. He got caught and he broke the law. That's not the problem. I mean, we need to arrest him and put him away. I get that, but he ain't the problem. The problem is,
I agree with you totally. But which stories do you know? I read this book. I read this book, but I know a lot of people who read this book, and what they really liked in the book is not what I've highlighted in my questions. They like that. They like the drama of the last 3 days, which is sort of like an HBO story, right? I mean, it's 8 days. Right. So there's, if you were if you were making a movie, that's what you'd focus on, those 8 days. It's just the drama, the tension, the sense of foreboding. I mean, it's perfect. It's a great script, right? Or they love the personal stories about the individuals. And the Madoff thing is the same way. I mean, it's just fascinating, right? But for me, it's more about the SEC than it is about Bernie Madoff.
Are you worried that we'll get distracted? That in a sense, and I don't know, I have no way to measure this, but that in the public consciousness, this was a bunch of criminals. Once we catch them, we can go back to business as usual. That it isn't, not in this, but it's sort of in the public consciousness. If we try to fix this problem, it's just, well, let's catch the Barry Madoffs, and then we won't have this problem. And if that's what most of most people are thinking, we're never going to get.
No, I don't actually think that's what the public thinks. I don't think there's evidence that that's what the public. I think there's a fascination. It's like, do you read the New York Times or do you read the New York Post? Okay, so a lot of people read the New York Post. Yeah, right, of course. I read the Times, so I can't get the Post. I mean,
I wish I could read the Post. Right.
I mean, we don't have a Post around here, that's for sure. But I don't think that's a problem. I think people, you take the public or even the educated public. I mean, the highly educated public who pay attention to these kind of things, it's very, very difficult to actually figure out and know exactly. You said we need more regulation, but then when the public debate begins, is it regulation A or regulation B? And I don't feel I have necessarily enough information. I have to read an awful lot to decide whether I really prefer it. So that's what we have.
Yeah.
That's what we have legislators for, and from my point of view, that's what we have an administration for, to guide us through that. And I'm willing to give them more credit than some people are for probably understanding better how to make this work than I do. Now, people will laugh at me. This will probably generate some conversation. This guy's crazy, But my point here is that I think we have a group of people now who actually, in the administration and to a good extent in the Congress, who believe we do need to bring back some serious regulation, okay? And then there are differences of view about that. But how they're going to do that and whether we go back again to the internal processes of the Congress, what's going to actually emerge is going to be an issue. And to the extent that the public doesn't so much think it's a bunch of crooks once we get rid of them, but thinks, just loses focus.
Right.
Says, all right, it's over. My 401k is in better shape than it was last year, which most people says. I hope.
A little bit.
Things are coming back. They're just going to lose focus on it.
Right.
And there are some powerful forces out there that are saying, no, let's not do this. You'll screw up the whole thing.
Well, you can hear it now. The government's trying to tell us what to do with our money. They think they know best. Look at what they did with, I don't know, whatever. The fact is that had it not been for the government spending in Medicare and Medicaid and the VA and military, this problem would have been a lot worse. And unemployment. So let me ask you, we'll move on to number 5 in a minute.
Which is what we really were on right now.
But here's a question: can you do this now within national borders, or does this require some kind of international regulation at this point? Have we gone beyond that?
Well, I think we still can do quite a bit with national regulation. If you're as big as we are, you can still do a lot with national regulation, I believe. Now, are there going to be a lot of holes in that system? Yeah, there are going to be a lot more holes than there were 30 or 40 years ago. But I still think you can do. I'm reading this book called Lords of Finance. I don't know if you know this book. This is about the 4 central bankers in the 1920s and 30s: Britain, France, Germany, and the U.S. And that was a system which was not nearly as open as ours, although it was more open than people realize. And I do think that we can't put in a regulatory regime which is going to be as tight as it was then. But we can do a lot more. And we can put one in which is going to be a lot more credible than the one we've had.
If those regulations in some way restricted the way individuals or say even brokerage houses could make money, I mean, what would stop you from investing through Chinese firms or Indian firms if they had a different set of regulations? The money gets to fly the borders, right?
It turns out it's a lot harder to invest in those firms than you think. Okay. I mean, Duke now is engaged in both India and China and trying to internationalize our campus. And there's a pretty heavy structure in those countries that would make it, it's not as if, I'll just go find my next loophole. And that's true in Europe as well. So I don't think it's, whether we need a coordinated regime, we're the least regulated, right? So the other systems are way more regulated than we are. So it's not like money necessarily is going to flow. Now, that's not the Canary Islands or something. That's a different, or the not the Canaries, the well,
Oh
some of the
yeah,
Caribbean.
yeah. Is it Bermuda? Where do they do? Where does that money fly?
Jeez.
Shows you how wise I am with my
Caymans,
investments.
the Caymans,
Grand
the Caymans.
That's right.
The
That's right.
Caymans. All right. I mean, they're always going to be the Caymans,
Right.
but that's not. I don't think that's a huge loophole in the system. It's when that's another one of those things that gets into the New York Post or something. I mean, the Times spent a lot of time on Bernie Madoff too. Truth be told, but so I don't think.
But again, the theory is this: you're right that we're the least regulated, and so there's no point in competing with us. But if you start changing the rules a little bit, make it a little tighter, somebody figures out, hey, there's a market now. Things have tightened up in the United States. I mean, that's how Delaware became the corporate headquarters, because they realized that if we loosen things up here, everybody's going to incorporate in Delaware.
But everybody doesn't incorporate in Delaware.
Not anymore.
Some
right.
people incorporate in Delaware,
Right.
and some people will take their money there.
Right.
But I don't think we're likely to see a huge flow, and I don't think we're likely to see the Europeans say, "Oh, here's our opportunity. Let's loosen up our structure so we can suck off the money that doesn't want to invest in the U.S. now because it's a little more regulated." I don't see that kind of scenario. It seems very, very unlikely. Just the political economic climate and culture of Europe is not going to do that. The Chinese it's a much riskier investment environment. India's probably even a riskier investment environment in some ways, in other ways less. But bureaucratically, India is a very difficult country to navigate. So I don't see that happening that much.
Let's, have we talked about this context of national discussions, what lessons might be learned in the corporate sector? Let's go off on a little flyer, and we're still inviting your emails at live@duke.edu, talking about House of Cards. If you look at some of the areas of the economy that aren't, housing is one of them, where it's very hard to make a profit at the low end. It's hard to make inexpensive houses and make a profit. That's something that we've learned a long time ago in housing, just because of the way the market works. You've got to have high margins to endure the booms and busts. What if a part of our economy moved not to a socialist economy, but a co-op economy, where people, in a sense, were building equity in their own firm? I own my company as a worker. I have a share in my company. What better incentive is there to work hard? Then I could eliminate an entire level of supervision because it's my company, and we do well this year, and I do well, and we don't do well. My pay got cut, not because investors decided that we could do with fewer employees, but honestly, we're just not making as many boots as we did last year.
There have been a lot of experiments with that. This is not an area of a lot of expertise for me, so I don't want to delve too deep into this. There have been a lot of experiments with that. Some have succeeded, most have not. Why they haven't, I'm not sufficient. But I think part of it is, it's like trying to embed a kernel of one structure in a much larger system of another. It's difficult to sustain.
Because of the surrounding
time.
culture. It would need a lot of support and nurturing.
Right, and the opportunities people see to make more money going elsewhere, what risk they're taking on. There's always been a lot of reluctance in the U.S. in particular for workers to take on responsibility for the firm, because they don't want to actually own the downside. They can't really manage. I mean, it works in a small context, but in a big, you're not going to be the manager. So then you're taking on the risk of bad management.
Right.
And you may not want to do that.
Well, it would probably change the structure of management as well. You'd have a lot more input into that. There'd be a lot more sort of grassroots, ground-up kinds of management. And the people who see every day how much waste there is, and at this point are not invested at all in letting anybody know.
I'm not opposed to this. I just think
there are a lot of obstacles.
There have been efforts, and there are lots of obstacles, and most of them don't succeed. I mean, from my point of view, it's unfortunate. But
it's interesting too to see how many sort of subterranean supports there are for. I mean, if you talk about transition to the green economy, for instance, if there were incentives, well, people say, well, if the market sees money in windmills, the money will go there. Well, unless you're subsidizing highways, and then there might be cheaper, but more people are using gas.
This is interesting. So we're doing a lot about this right now. And yesterday I went to a talk by Amory Lovins. Okay, so he's big on that point. He argues there are huge and profitable efficiencies to be gained okay? And he has lots of fabulous examples. And when you talk to a lot of corporate heads, they'll tell you actually they're doing a lot of this. That is that it is profitable for them to spend less on energy. And so there's innovation there. But then there are lots of sunk costs too that build up very entrenched interests that are delaying change, okay? And he has a wonderful example which I thought was actually interesting. So it turns out it's way more efficient to deliver certain things through pipes if the angles on the pipes are never right angles, okay? But we historically have always done these things with right angles. And if you do them this way, okay, so you might say, well, there would be advantage to every new plant having been. But what are we going to do with that huge backlog? It's sort of the cash for clunkers, right? We're not going to offer the cash for clunker industrial plants. And the capital cost of changing that takes a long time to recoup. So I'm just using that as an example. So there's a tremendous amount of inefficiency built up in the system. But I actually, I actually believe that government regulation will play some role, but I also, and certainly also getting rid of some subsidies would help, because we're actually subsidizing coal when there are alternatives that would do better in the marketplace if coal were not subsidized.
And if you think that through on the long time, well, but it is true. We're subsidizing coal, and that means that when the time comes for us to decide whether to build a new coal plant, and we're looking at productivity now, today, energy needs today or in the next 10 years, well, you might say, let's build the plant. Now, once I build it, well, I've got this plant, and it's good for 30 years, and I've got to have it. So if you don't start taking steps today, you know, you end up. So
we've just converted an old coal steam plant at Duke into a natural gas plant. Okay, but that plant was dead in the water. Our need went up, and so we had a choice: either build a new thing or convert the old one. We converted the old. Or we got a third choice, which is let's burn coal again in the old one. We said, well, we're not doing that. So there's some principle piece, there's a profitability piece, and there's sort of like, can you absorb the short-term costs for the long-term gain? And that's obviously, but I think my broader point is, while government regulation and subsidy will help, I think also there will be profit advantages within the private sector for going to more energy efficient things if we make them appropriately available, and that's happening.
Well, and I think that's the wonderful thing, again, about this book, is it really allows you to think deeply about the role government can play as at least a referee, pulling itself out of some areas that it's been very helpful in, we don't always notice, and just sort of refereeing the way the game is played.
Exactly.
So it's fascinating. Great discussion.
Right, I enjoyed it myself.
Really
Thank you so much.
Talk with you,
Yeah,
Peter Lange. Great discussion. Thanks for talking and joining us today on Duke Reads. The book, of course, House of Cards, The Tale of Hubris and Wretched Excess on Wall Street, William D. Cohan. And be sure to tune in to Duke's Ustream channel tomorrow, Friday, November 6th at noon Eastern, for an office hours conversation with Kimberly Rorschach, director of Duke's Nasher Museum of Art. She's going to talk about the soon-to-be concurrent exhibits of two major modern artists, Pablo Picasso and Andy Warhol. So that is tomorrow, November 6th at noon Eastern, for that discussion. Next week, because we've got these compressed now, so our next book, next week, Duke Reads, November 11th on a Wednesday. Rajana Khanna will discuss White Tiger by Arvind Adiga, and we look forward to being with you and seeing you then. Thank you.